Wish We Could Turn Back Time by Girlinpink44. Chapter 8. Heavy Weight. There had been a time where Tony had loved the beach. It was partially why he had built the Malibu mansion in its location. He loved to sit out on his deck and watch the waves, sip coffee, and enjoy a bit of ocean air before burying himself into his workshop. He had a private beach, one he hadn't touched since Afghanistan. Even before, he hadn't used it a lot, but after being trapped in that cave, after the waterboarding, after the sand of the desert, the beach had lost its appeal. When Morgan was about 3, Tony had decided it was time to face his fears head on, so he decided that they would go to the beach. At first, he hated it. He hated the feeling of sand on his feet, the feeling of water. But Morgan had loved it. She wanted to share it with her dad. She was too young to understand things like anxiety, panic attacks, and PTSD. Perhaps Tony had wanted to shelter her from a world where bad things could happen for as long as he could. It might have been for the best, considering he had died before she had even entered kindergarten. So he had braved the ocean. He had made a sandcastle. He had even let her bury him in the sand and had only had one small panic attack during that. During that long weekend, he had made some good memories that involved things that had a lot of bad attached to them. It wasn't to say that his fear was gone, and that suddenly he wanted to move from their house on the lake to a beach home again, though he had considered rebuilding the Malibu mansion. The sun was rising and he found himself on the deck sipping a cup of coffee and just enjoying the ocean. It was quiet. Not many people were awake yet. And it was peaceful. He had gotten spoiled to peace during the years between the snaps. Just like he had gotten used to the crushing weight left behind by his boys vanishing in the snap. Part of him felt robbed of that peace. But when he'd woken up between the two boys, he had never felt more complete. He wished for Morgan, wished for the chance to introduce her to her little brothers. And maybe he'd get that chance again. He had gotten all the other people that had been on his heart, on his mind, as the world faded to black. The door opened, and he looked up to see Rhodey and Happy making their way out, mugs of coffee in their hands.
Morning, guys. Boss. Tones.
The two sat down on either side of him, and for a few minutes, it was quiet, as the three just enjoyed each other's company.
I'm sorry, Tony broke the silence, for dragging you guys into this mess. For dragging everyone back into a world that doesn't know it's still sleeping, and that the universe is so much bigger and terrifying than we can imagine. I'm not.
Brody leaned over.
I'm not sorry at all that I'm here. That I can stand by your side again as we fix this. That I can make sure you're there to see all 3 of your kids grow up. He's right. I don't run around in a suit like you two. But Rhodey can have Iron Man's back, and I'll have Tony Stark's.
Tony smiled at the two men.
I don't even know where to start. What? We take care of Obi quietly this time. And then what? We make friends with Dr. Foster, and maybe meet Thor when he's on Earth the first time? Warn him about Loki? There's Cap. That's gonna be tricky. Happy winced. Might give things away if I walk up to him and punch him in the face.
I'm going to have to hold off the spiderling. He got hold of the footage from Siberia not too long before everything fell apart. Tony leaned back. 2018. Tony sat in his workshop, waiting on the kid to get back from grabbing a snack. While the field trip was taking longer than he expected, he assumed the kid got distracted by talking to one of his friends.
Boss, Peter is in emotional distress.
Shooting out of his chair, Tony took off and followed Friday's blinking lights to wherever and whatever it was that got Peter in this state. To his surprise, Friday led him to his study. Peter had only been in there a handful of times, as Tony tended to use it when the kid wasn't around, and he couldn't avoid the massive amounts of paperwork or the more business side of SI. Looking around, he didn't immediately see the kid, but knew that if Friday had led him here, the kid was nearby.
Rue, you around?
Tony took a couple of steps in and caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Looking up, he saw Peter in the corner of the room, his eyes wide with panic.
Pete, can you come down?
Peter turned to better face the boy.
What happened?
The kid's heart rate and breathing were too fast.
Kid, I need you to breathe with me, okay?
Tony wished she could figure out a way to talk the kid down off the ceiling.
Let's breathe together, okay?
They breathed for a few minutes, Peter's heart rate calming down. After a bit, he climbed down from the ceiling and promptly ran into Tony's arms.
Hey! What's going on, Spiderling?
I didn't mean to.
Didn't mean to what?
Peter held on tighter, burying his head into the crook of Tony's neck. He could feel the warm tears fall. Ned texted me about an assignment due on Friday. I have it on the cloud, and you said I could use the computer if I needed to.
I'm not following.
Tony led the kid to a small couch he kept in there. I logged in, but couldn't remember what I saved the file as. So I typed in a few keywords to try and find it, and I found some footage and it started playing. Tony felt a chill run down his spine. Considering the number of missions he had run as Iron Man, even a few things as Tony Stark, this initial statement did nothing to narrow down the plethora of potentially bad things that were in his archives. There was no telling which one it was. Though, to have the kid this upset. I saw what happened in Siberia. He was your friend, your teammate, and he left you. He left you there to die. Of all the things that Peter could have found, that was perhaps the one he wished the kid would never see.
But I didn't. I'm right here, Pete.
But what if you hadn't? Then we couldn't. I wouldn't. How could he? Tears came harder.
He was protecting his friend.
His friend murdered your parents! Tony let out a sigh.
Hydra killed my parents. Sergeant Barnes just had the unfortunate position of being the weapon they used.
It had taken a long time for Tony to make peace with that, to realise that he was at least partially responsible for what had happened in that cave. He had thrown the first punch. Unfortunately, it seems as if Peter didn't see that, or didn't understand the complex layers that led to the point in that cave. No, this innocent kid had been dragged into that mess by Tony. It was, to date, the biggest regret of Tony's life, and he had quite a few there. He should have left the kid in Queens, fighting the good fight, and looking out for the little guy. But, at the same time, he couldn't completely bring himself to regret it. Because of his mistake, he met Peter. He met this dorky little kid from Queens, who managed to do what many people thought was impossible. He made his way into Tony Stark's heart. Now, almost 2 years later, he's sitting there with the kid in his arms, trying to console him. It's a long way from the incidents with the car door.
Shh, Spiderling. It's okay. I'm here. I'm safe. You're here. We're both safe.
They sat there on the couch for a while. Tony's hand found its way into Peter's curls, as it so often did. When it did, Peter let out a little sigh, and Tony found himself with an armful of limp spiderling. Tony would manage to adopt himself a child whose love language was touch, Even up to that point, he managed to avoid it as much as possible. But when a certain teenage hero made its way into Tony's heart and life, he caused the man to change. And some would say it was for the better. And some would say he had gotten soft. Personally, he agreed with the former.
What do you say we order Chinese from that little place in town?
While the compound didn't have the options the city had, there was this surprisingly good mum-and-pop Chinese place in the small town about 10 miles from the compound. Tony wondered if the business they got from the compound was part of the reason they stayed open. After all, 10 miles one way was a long way to bring a delivery. "Can we get the egg rolls and dumplings?" Peter looked up, his brown eyes still shining with unshed tears. Tony wiped away one that fell.
Absolutely. Gotta feed that spider belly, or your aunt will yell at me again. And neither of us want that.
"I don't know. If I'm not in trouble, I don't necessarily mind." Peter's grin was sheepish and still hesitant as he calmed down from the panic attack.
You wound me. My own protege, ready to throw me under the bus.
Tony grinned at the kid as they prepared to order food. He was sure the discussion wasn't over, but for now, food might make it better. 2008. Tony shook his head as if shaking away the memory.
But the Cap Will Me isn't the one I fought. He isn't the one who betrayed me. You don't think they'll come back? The others?
Tony shook his head.
I don't foresee anyone else coming back unless the Stones decide there's someone else. As far as I'm concerned, I don't need anyone else. Actually, I was thinking about that.
Happy spoke up, and Tony turned to him.
Over the years, we would get letters now and then. Remember Charles Xavier and his school? I gave them tech to make sure the school was taken care of. What if we approach them first? They could be potential allies. They have as much at stake as this.
Rhodey added as he leaned forward, his relaxed posture now eager at the idea of help.
More. There's a potential we could make sure that whatever version of the Accords that pops up helps them. Make sure they have rights. It doesn't limit them. It protects them. You want the Accords?
Happy's voice was not as shocked as it was resigned. Tony didn't blame him. After the mess that had been the Accords last time, there was a part of him that didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But there was a part of him that knew that they would happen again, and if they could get in earlier, they could make a big difference. It was more than him this time. It was his son.
I want a form of them. I still believe we need accountability. I still believe that people should feel safe when we come to save the day. But what if we come in from the ground level? What if, after I reveal I'm Iron Man to the world, I work with the military, the United Nations? I could get in before Ross does and cut his power down.
Tony stood up, his coffee forgotten. He walked the length of the deck. Even with his family here, this task, the job the Stones had given him, seemed completely overwhelming. There were so many moving parts, so many things he couldn't control. What about the domino effect? What about the others? His so-called team and family? Sure, there were some he remembered fondly, like Bruce. Despite his absence, Tony missed his friend. He needed his friend, but he also needed his friend's alter ego. Not many things could stand up against that alien army like the Hulk. He sat back down with a sigh.
I can't stop what happens to Bruce, but we can find him the second he surfaces.
The idea of having the science bros in the lab again was something that Tony would love. To have Harley and Peter in there as two generations worked on solving issues and making discoveries sounded like the coolest way to spend a day. He had missed Bruce for those 2 years. They had caught up in the 5 years though, and occasionally Bruce could be found in Tony's garage, when he wasn't corralled by Morgan wanting to play with her Uncle Bruce.
I don't think we need to rush into anything. Staying is the most pressing issue. Thor won't be here until 2010. Cap won't be found until a few months before New York.
Brody's tact, yet delicate way of mentioning two things he really didn't want to talk about managed not to trigger Tony's anxiety.
There's still Hydra.
They're still embedded in S.H.I.E.L.D., who's about to come knocking on your door. Coulson was at the press conference yesterday. Happy, of course, would be aware of everyone who was in the building yesterday, even though it technically wasn't officially his job yet. That's why Happy was one of the few people he trusted in his life.
We need to make sure those idiots don't dump that info on the web for the world to find. Luckily I contained some of it, but a lot of good people lost their lives because of Cap's move.
It was still something that annoyed him to this day. Something that he was never quite able to shake off. He wondered if Cap leaving him out of the loop was the first crack in their relationship. Actually, he wondered if it went back to their first meeting. Tension was high and that battle brought them together, but there was bad blood there. Tony was nothing like Howard, and Steve had trouble reconciling his time jump. And Tony hated how he could never measure up to Steve in his father's eyes. Even with years of therapy, Tony still hadn't worked through his feelings towards his former family and his teammates. It was even more complicated because, for all of the others, none of the emotional baggage Tony carried even existed. He knew the second he announced that he was in fact Iron Man, Nick Fury would attempt to break in again and tell him about his super secret boy band. Did he want to join? Iron Man, yes, crossed out. Tony Stark, not recommended, crossed out. It was still something that haunted him to this day. Dad? He turned to see Peter standing by the back door, and Tony held out his arms and was quickly rewarded with an armful of spiderling. Tony kissed the top of the boy's head.
Good morning, Roo. Sleep well?
Peter nodded, snuggling close as if he were considering going back to sleep. Tony saw both of his brothers looking at the kid and smiling. Within minutes, his breathing evened out again, and the kid was fast asleep. Tony ran his hand through the kid's curls, carefully detangling the sleep-ruffled mess.
This is one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given. I missed him. And now he's here, and he calls me Dad.
Tony smiled at the kid.
Took him long enough.
Happy muttered,
You still owe me $20, Happy.
Money exchanged hands, and Tony looked between the pair.
Dare I ask? We had a bet going as to how long it would take for the kid to start calling you Dad. I said it would take within a year. Brody said it would take a world-ending crisis and one of you almost dying. I would say I cannot believe you two would bet on something like that, but I've known you both for most of my life, so I can.
Tony chuckled. There he is. May walked out onto the deck, a cup of coffee in hand. I checked in and he wasn't there. Need to be topped off, Tony?
I would love that. I was going to get up and grab it, but I was claimed.
May smiled. You thought he was bad as a teenager? He's going to be worse now. He loves to cuddle. She headed back inside and came out a couple of minutes later with a fresh cup of coffee that Tony happily accepted with his free hand. What are we going to do? The sigh that escaped May as she sat betrayed her age. The years that never were.
About
this whole situation? You're living here, and we're back in New York. This week will be easier, but school is going to be a nightmare for him. Tony winced at the idea of both boys having to complete the school year again.
I'm going to look for a place in New York until the tower is done. Jay, remind me to get started on that now instead of later. Of course, sir. But it may take me a few weeks. We can stimulate his education there. Maybe let him take some classes he couldn't fit in last time around. By the time he's back in high school, we could dual enrollment, and he might have associates by the time he graduates high school.
It was something he had planned on suggesting for both boys in the previous timeline. Neither was properly challenged in school. He may have to have a conversation with Rose sooner rather than later about Harley. Maybe bringing him to New York could help him keep both boys sane, as they got a second chance at most of their childhoods. You've given this a lot of thought.
I was already thinking of suggesting it for the last school year. Honestly, kid doesn't want to leave his friends.
He's already met Ned by this point. He won't leave him again.
That friendship may be tricky.
May gave him a hard look. Peter won't let Ned go.
We'll figure it out then.
Tony nodded. He couldn't stop everything that would come their way, but he would do everything he could for both of his boys. He'd save the universe and make sure he's stayed intact this time around. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. I hope I got the emotions right for Peter in that flashback. Oh, that's nasty. But it's a thing in fiction, in the fan fiction thing, isn't it? Like with Nat calling Peter her baby spider, the field trip arc, Peter finding out what Cap did by accidentally finding the video of the footage from that. Like, yeah. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed again. Remember to like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care, okay? Love you. Bye.